Greetings, and thank you for joining us today on the session Coaching Conversations That Build Leaders, a leadership training on performance, ownership, and growth. I want to start today with a story that may feel uncomfortably familiar. A few years ago, I worked with a highly respected leader, smart, dedicated, trusted. Everyone went to her for answers, and on the surface, that looked like strong leadership. But behind the scenes, she was exhausted. Her calendar was wall-to-wall meetings, her inbox never stopped, and the same types of questions kept coming up: staffing decisions, parent issues, operational calls. When we slowed things down and mapped where decisions were being made, the pattern was obvious. Almost every meaningful decision flowed back to her, not because her team lacked intelligence, not because they were disengaged, but because they had learned something very specific over time. If I bring this to the leader, it's safer. That's the hidden cost of being the fixer. Research from the Center of Creative Leadership shows that one of the most common leadership derailers is becoming a decision bottleneck. Leaders who unintentionally slow progress by over involving themselves. This is where coaching conversations begin, not as a technique, but as a response to overload. Today is about learning how to change the pattern of learning and leading conversations so responsibility stops flowing upward and starts flowing outward. Before we go any further, I want to be really clear about how we're going to spend our time together today. This is not a lecture. It's not about adding more to your leadership plate. It's about changing how you use the time and conversations that you already have. We're going to start by grounding ourselves in why coaching matters, not as a buzzword and not as something nice to have, but as a practical response to real leadership pressure, things like overload, decision fatigue, and burnout. Then we'll look at the difference between managing and coaching. Most leaders don't intend to overmanage. What actually happens is that under pressure, we default to telling. We'll name that pattern and talk about why it's so common. After that, we'll spend a few minutes on what's happening in the brain during leadership conversations. This part is important because it explains why telling feels efficient in the moment and why it often creates more work later. From there, we'll move into practical tools you can use immediately. I'll walk you through the GROW model, which gives structure to coaching conversations, and the 5-minute coaching approach, which shows how coaching fits into real, busy leadership days. Finally, we'll close with a leadership commitment, not a big, abstract goal, but one specific behavior you can practice this week. My goal is that you don't leave today with more information. I want you to leave with a different way of showing up in the conversations you're already having. Let's start with why coaching actually matters, because this is where a lot of leadership conversations get shallow. Coaching matters because the complexity of work has changed. Leaders are dealing with more ambiguity, more competing priorities, and more decisions than ever before. And here's the reality: no leader can scale by being the answer to everything. When leaders coach, performance improves because expectations become clearer. People understand not just what to do, but how decisions are made and what success looks like. Coaching also increases engagement, and engagement isn't about people being happy at work, it's about what they put in with their energy. Gallup's research shows that employees who receive regular coaching are significantly more engaged and productive than those who don't. Engaged people think ahead. They take initiative. They care about outcomes. Over time, coaching reduces leader workload. And this part is important, not immediately, but eventually. At first, coaching feels slower. It takes more patience. But over time, it eliminates repeated questions, constant checking, and unnecessary escalation. Leaders who coach don't solve fewer problems, they solve them at the right level. Instead of being the place where your thinking ends, they become the place where thinking begins. Manager versus coaching. This is where leadership breakdowns actually happen. Not because leaders don't care, and not because they don't know better, but because pressure changes how we show up. Managing and coaching are both important. Let me be very clear about that. Managing is about execution. It's about making sure things get done correctly, on time, and with expectations. Coaching is about development. It's about how people think, decide, and grow over time. The problem isn't managing. The problem is when managing becomes the only mode we use, especially under stress. Under pressure, leaders default to telling. Someone brings you a problem, and your instinct is to fix it. It feels efficient. It feels responsible. And honestly, it feels relieving in the moment. But here's the cost we don't always see. Every time you tell someone exactly what to do, we answer the immediate question and we quietly teach a longer lesson. Don't think too far ahead. Don't decide unless you're sure. Bring it to me. Over time, people stop practicing judgment. They stop anticipating. They stop owning decisions. Coaching does something different. Coaching slows the moment just enough to build the muscle of thinking. Instead of answering the question, the coach asks, what are you seeing? What options have you considered? What feels most aligned with our goals and values? That moment of discomfort, that pause, is where growth happens. Managing creates compliance. Coaching creates capacity. And here's the tension every leader has to hold. Coaching almost always feels slower in the short term, but it dramatically fastens things in the long term. Leaders who coach don't do less work, they do the right work. There's a reason why coaching works that has nothing to do with personality or leadership style. It has everything to do with how the human brain functions under pressure. When a leader tells, corrects, interrupts, or overrides, the brain often perceives threat, even if the leader's intent is helpful. In that moment, the amygdala activates. This is the part of the brain responsible for fight, flight, or freeze. When the amygdala is active, the thinking part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, goes offline. That means reasoning, creativity, learning, and reflection all decrease. People may comply, but they're no longer learning. David Rock's research on neuroscience of leadership explains why directive leadership often feels productive in moments but creates long-term codependency. Coaching does the opposite. When leaders ask genuine questions, the brain receives a different signal. Questions signal curiosity rather than threat. The prefrontal cortex stays engaged. People think more clearly, they reflect, they take ownership. This is where the psychological safety comes in, and it's often misunderstood. Psychological safety does not mean lowering standards or avoiding accountability. It means creating an environment where people can think out loud without fear of being shut down. Google's Project Aristotle studied hundreds of teams and found that psychological safety was the single strongest predictor of high performance. Coaching creates that safety, not just by being soft, but being intentional. Asking, help me understand your thinking, keeps learning alive. Saying, just do it my way, ends the learning, even if the task gets done. At this point, we've talked about why coaching matters and why telling backfires. Now I want to slow things way down and talk about how coaching actually works in practice. The biggest misconception about coaching is that it's vague, unconstructed, or overly conversational. In reality, effective coaching is highly structured. It just doesn't feel controlled. The GROW model gives leaders a simple framework to guide coaching conversations without talking over thinking. GROW stands for goal, reality, options, and way forward. This model is powerful because it mirrors how good thinking actually happens, and it keeps leaders from jumping straight to solutions. G, goal, defining what good looks like. Coaching always starts with clarity. Before we talk about problems, we have to talk about success. The goal question sounds simple, but it's often skipped. Leaders assume everyone shares the same definition of success, and most of the time they don't. Asking, what does success look like, does several things at once. It aligns expectations, it slows reactive thinking, and it forces prioritization. Without a clear goal, coaching conversations drift into venting or fixing. A strong goal question might sound like, if this went really well, what would be different? What outcomes are actually trying to achieve? What matters most in this situation? When leaders skip the goal, they often solve the wrong problem. Coaching begins by making sure you're aimed at the right target. Next is R, reality. Getting honest without blame. Once the goal is clear, the next step is reality. Reality is not about judgment, it's about understanding what's actually happening, not what we wish were happening. This is where leaders often jump into the correct time of reinterpreting. Coaching requires restraint. Good reality questions sound like this: what's happening right now? What have you already tried? What's getting in the way? The key here is curiosity. When leaders rush through reality, they miss context. And when context is missed, solutions fail. Reality grounds the conversation in facts, not assumptions, and it helps people feel heard before they're challenged. Next is O, options, where ownership is built. This is the heart of coaching. Options here are where leaders must resist the urge to jump in. When leaders provide options too quickly, ownership shifts back to them. Coaches asks, what options do you see? What else could you try? If there were no constraints, what would you consider? This stage expands thinking. It invites creativity. It pushes people beyond their first, safest answer. Sir John Widmore emphasized that ownership emerges when people generate their own solution. Even imperfect options are valuable because the thinking muscle is being exercised. Leaders can guide with direction by asking the following questions. What's the upside of that option? What are the risks? What options align best with our values? This is where confidence is built. Finally is W, the way forward, turning thinking into action. Coaching without action is just conversation. Way forward is where commitment happens. The goal here is specificity. Strong way forward questions sound like this: what will you do next? By when? How will you know it worked? This step turns insight into behavior. Without it, coaching feels good, but nothing changes. Way forward always creates accountability without pressure. The commitment comes from the person being coached, not the leader. Why grow works and why leaders struggle with it. Grow works because it's aligned with how adults learn. Adults learn best when they clarify goals, reflect on reality, explore options, and commit to action. Leaders struggle with grow because it requires restraint. It requires trusting the process and trusting the person. Coaching feels uncomfortable at first because it removes the leader's safety net of having the right answers. But over time, it produces something far more valuable: people who can think, decide, and act independently. Now, let's make this practical. Grow is not meant to be a 60-minute conversation. It fits into 5 minutes. You might not hit every letter perfectly every time, and that's okay. A 5-minute coaching conversation might sound like this: what are you trying to accomplish here? What's happening right now? What options are you considering? What will you do next? That's coaching. Leaders who practice this consistently see fewer escalations and stronger ownership. Coaching works not because it's dramatic, because it's repeatable. Before we close, I want to bring together two important things: your leadership commitment and where you go next for support. Because real leadership growth doesn't happen in a single section, it happens when intention turns into practice and practice turns into habit. A few minutes ago, I asked you to think about one person you lead, not your easiest person, not your most challenging one, just one. Please commit to one small shift, asking before telling, even once this week. That commitment matters. But commitments stick when leaders have reminders, structures, and reinforcement, not just good intention. That's where EduQuenture comes in. At EduQuenture, we built leadership trainings and free resources specifically for leaders who are trying to do exactly what we talked about today, moving from solving every problem themselves to developing people who can think and decide with confidence. If your commitment today is to practice coaching conversations more intentionally, there are short, practical tools you can use to support that. Things like reflection guides, coaching question prompts, and quick decision-making frameworks.